Today we're going to review the Naturehike Cloud-Up 1, but the long-term impressions will be based on the Cloud-Up 3 that we used on an 11,000 kilometer bike tour of Australia. So stay tuned to hear what we like and dislike about the tent and how it stands up to long-term use. Alright, welcome to the review. Before we get into this one, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it really is the best way to help us out. We upload reviews and first impressions of bike packing and bike touring gear, as well as tips, tricks, and tutorials that could really help you out on your own bike trips. And then there's the main feature of the channel, a 93-part series documenting our 11,000 kilometer bike tour of Australia. So if that's the kind of stuff you're into, give us a sub. The Naturehike Cloud-Up series is a range of lightweight budget tents featuring a 1, a 2, and a 3-man version. And although I've got the 1-man version with me here today, a lot of the points I'm going to touch on will be relevant to the 2 and the 3-man. So it's worth sticking around if you're interested in either of those. They're available in 2 different materials, but I'm going to be reviewing the 20 denier nylon version, which I believe is the superior version based on the weight and the strength of the material. This version weighs 1.6 kilograms, which, while not being the lightest tent out there, is definitely reasonable, and especially for the price. The tent comes with all the usual stuff: pegs, poles, guy lines, and a footprint. The footprint is a very welcome addition to help you protect the bottom of the tent, but the pegs are pretty cheap and nasty. On our tour, we ended up bending most of our pegs, and we had to replace them eventually. So let's go outside and set it up. The Cloud-Up series are 2-piece tents, meaning you have an inner which forms the main structure of the tent, and then a rain fly over the top to keep the elements out. When I put the tent away, I like to roll the inner up inside the footprint, so that way it all rolls out and deploys together, at which point you need to peg out the corners. Don't do this too tight, just enough to give the floor its shape. Then assemble the 1-piece pole system and secure the ends of the pole into the corners and clip the inner mesh into place. Finally, you can throw the rain fly over and clip it into the small buckles in the corners of the inner or the footprint, and then peg out the edges and the vestibule. Follow these steps in the same order, and after you've done it a couple of times, it really does go up quickly. Alright, so a word on longevity. We got about 2 years of use out of our Cloud-Up 3 before eventually the zip started to fail. And out of those 2 years, about 7 months was continuous heavy use whilst on a bike tour. So all in all, I'd say that we probably got about a year's heavy continuous use out of it, which isn't bad for a tent of this price. You can spend a hell of a lot more on a tent and still have it fail after a year of constant heavy use. I'm pretty sure the zip would actually be replaceable, but most people would just buy a new one for a tent of this price. So overall, a pretty good result. I don't think most people realize how quickly a lightweight tent can deteriorate when you're living in it full time. So this was a pretty admirable performance from the Naturehike. So now let's look at some likes and dislikes. First like is the price. I paid 150 Australian dollars for this, which is pretty amazing for what you get. And for that kind of price, I think the longevity that I just talked about is pretty reasonable. And if you nurse it a little bit, or you're just more careful than we were, you could probably get even more life out of it. I also like the size. I'm 6'3" and I've got plenty of room. It's surprisingly spacious for a 1-man tent, and the 3-man was perfect for 2 of us plus a bit of gear. But if I was just an inch or 2 taller, that would probably be a problem. The color's great, really like the forest green, super stealthy, and they do have bright colors available if that's your thing. It's got a pretty decent pack size. I mean, I can just slot this into my saddlebag really easily, and it practically disappears into a pannier. Bonnie carried the 3-man tent when we were touring, and she just strapped it on the rear rack with no issues. And finally, I like the quick and easy setup. The 1-piece pole system makes things super easy, and the little buckles in the corners are just genius. Alright, now the dislikes. And first up is the elephant in the room. And that is, this tent is actually a copy of the Fly Creek by Big Agnes. So there are obviously moral implications to copying someone else's product and then selling it. And there are moral implications to buying a copy when you know about the original. So a lot of people would argue that you shouldn't really buy this tent, and instead you should be supporting Big Agnes for designing it and originally creating it. And this is a fair point that I would tend to agree with, but a lot of people can't afford a Big Agnes. So I'm not going to get too into it, but it is a consideration, and I'm definitely going to put this down as a negative about this tent. So following on from the last point, I would say that if this tent breaks, you're probably on your own. I think it's quite unlikely that you'd get the same level of warranty or support as you would from a company like, I don't know, let's say Big Agnes. And finally, you are most likely going to have to replace the pegs that came with this, which isn't the end of the world, but it is a little bit of a hassle and it is extra cost. All right, so wrapping up. Overall, I really like this tent, and I think it's the best budget option out there right now. It's a tried and tested design, and it was super reliable for us in all sorts of tough conditions. It's always kept us dry, and until the zip failed, we had zero issues with it. And it doesn't matter how much money you spend, zip failure will happen to every tent eventually. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments if you own this tent or if you've got any questions about it. And as always, give us a thumbs up if you liked the video and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more. Cheers!